The prayer of Jesus in John 17 is one of his 21 prayers recorded in the Gospels. It has been called a mountain peak of revelation, the most sacred passage in all the Gospels. It's been called the Holy of Holies of prayer. Many have called it the high priestly prayer, or the prayer of consecration. I have called it the true Lord's Prayer, in contrast to the popular notion of Matthew 6, 9-13, having that title. That Matthew prayer is really a disciple's prayer. This one is the Lord's. And it is for God's life-in-life plan for the whole world. It stands alone for its life-in-life thoroughness and profoundness. There are many ways to walk through this prayer in our study. The journey is far too rich to condense it into a 15-minute message like I have to do here, but I will do so by looking at 5 recurring themes found in the Lord's words before the Father. Those 4 themes are God's glory, His name, knowledge, world, and oneness. What I want to show is how the larger theme of divine life that we have traced in our studies of John from the beginning unifies these 5 themes. That unifying dynamic brings us to an important conclusion from this prayer, and that is this. It is a prayer for God's life-in-life gospel plan for the whole world. The Lord's first word in this prayer is Father, and that points to the theme of divine life, because God is the Father of that life. Though common in prayer today, that reference to God was not found in all the Old Testament, nor was it common in the Jewish vocabulary of Christ's time. Jesus made it common as He made God known in this way, as Father. Knowing God as the Father of life now then flows easily into each of the 5 themes found in this prayer. First, consider the words glory and glorify, as found in verses 1 and 2, 4 and 5, and 10 in the first half of the prayer, and then in verses 22 to 24 in the last half, showing that it's a unifying theme. These words are highlighted by John throughout this entire gospel, actually. To understand the word glory is actually to understand John's whole gospel. Glory or glorify occurs 14 times in the first 11 chapters of John, recording the Lord's public ministry. John 1:14, for example, establishes the theme, and it says, "We have seen His glory." The last reference in those first 11 chapters is in chapter 11, verse 40, where Jesus told Martha, "If you believe, you will see the glory of God." So it is a unifying theme. The theme of glory and glorious also occurs 19 times in the last 10 chapters of John, and there they are more focused on the Lord's coming crucifixion, resurrection, and ascension into heaven. In this chapter, chapter 17, verse 1, Jesus spoke to the Father and said, "Glorify your Son, that your Son may glorify you." In verse 10, Jesus said, "Glory has come to me through them," meaning the disciples. He goes on to use the words 2 more times in the opening verses of this prayer. The last reference is in verse 24 of our passage, where Jesus asked the Father to permit the disciples to see His glory, which He had from before the world began. Now, I mentioned the first and last half of the prayer to go show that from beginning to end, this prayer highlights the glory of God and links it to God's eternal life, His eternal life-in-life gospel plan for the whole world. God's glory is God's life. It is the summation of all He is. The word glorify, however, is more difficult to relate to divine life, but I've noticed that every time Jesus used it in this prayer, it was a reference to what He did because of that divine life within Him. So when Jesus told Martha, "You will see the glory of God," He told her, "You will see God's life." When in the verses of chapter 17, Jesus said, "Glorify your Son," He said, really, "Let the life shine in me." When He said, that your Son may glorify you," He was really saying that I can reflect your life to others. And when he said, I have brought you glory, he said, I have made your life known, heard, seen, and felt. Verse 5 captures the relationship of God's glory and God's life in a striking way when Jesus talked about the glory or the life I had with you before the world began. The Father and Son's glory was expressed as one divine life that is all glorious, the life of God. But as said in a previous message from John 13, God's glory was meant to be passed on. How? By His life indwelling the human life of believers. Jesus made this clear again in this prayer, verse 22, when He says, I have given them the glory that you gave me. The glorious life that He had was the glorious life He would give them. In verse 10, Jesus said, glory has come to me through them. Now, He wasn't glorified in them by what they said or did. He was glorified in them because they bore His divine life. There is no other glory or there is no other glorification. It all comes down to the presence of God's life and nothing else in Jesus and in believers. So the Lord's reference to eternal life in verses 2 and 3 is easily related to this subject of God's glory as God's life. When glory is not seen as God's life, the statements seem to get off the subject. They're kind of hard to relate to the rest of the prayer. They seem awkward, out of place. It's sort of an intrusion to the flow of revelation. But that is not the case when glory and divine life are linked as I think they are. In verse 2, Jesus linked the glorification of Father and Son to His authority over all flesh or over all human life. For what purpose? To give eternal life to all whom the Father gives Him. The second theme in this prayer is the name of God as seen in verses 6 to 12 in the first half and verses 25 to 26 in the last half. Again, a unifying theme. Let's look at some of the instances of its use. In verse 6, Jesus said, I have revealed your name. Later in verse 11, He said, Holy Father, protect them by the power of your name, the name you gave me. Then He added, I protected them and kept them safe by the name you gave me. And again in verse 25, Jesus said, I have made your name known to them and will continue to make you known. As learned in earlier messages, reference to the name anywhere in the Bible is reference to divine life because it refers to God's character and His nature. These two words, divine life and name, belong together in our study. Human life is characterized by millions of names. Divine life is characterized by one name. So in this prayer, Jesus said, I have revealed your life. Protect the disciples by your life. I have made your life known to them. That name, as disclosed to Moses, was Ehyeh, I am. That's in Exodus chapter 3, verses 13 and 14. In the third person of the Hebrew language, that name becomes Jehovah. He is. So I am, He is. A name the Jews refused to pronounce in public, but a name Jesus deliberately pronounced in the course of His teachings. Jesus had even claimed the I am as His own name in the gospel record from John 1 to chapter 16. This is the name He referred to in this prayer. It is the name of divine life. That name would continue to be important to God's life and life gospel plan to the whole world. Not one of the many words for God found in the languages of our world communicate what the name really conveys. Nor does any doctrine, any ideal, principle, or program. The name of God is unique. The third theme is knowledge, as found in verses 3, verses 7 and 9, and then again in 25 and 26, again in the first and the last half of the prayer. Know, or its derivatives, occurs 9 times in this prayer. As with the other themes, the word know and divine life belong together. In verse 3, Jesus said, Now this is eternal life, that they know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ whom you have sent. This knowledge is not derived from simple thinking and the processing of ideas. This knowledge, ginosko in the Greek language, is intimate, personal, and interactive knowledge based on revelation. described best, I believe, in the life-in-life relationship of God's making. The other references to this knowledge indicate that the Lord's Word, His revelation or His truth, was the basis of that knowledge. In verse 7, Jesus said, "Now they know that everything you have given me comes from you." In verse 8, He said, "They knew with certainty that I came from you." Later in verse 23, after mentioning unity, our fourth theme, Jesus said that when disciples became united, then the world will know that you sent me. Finally, the word is used 5 times in the last 2 verses of the prayer. So let me read verses 25 to 26. "Righteous Father, though the world does not know you, I know you, and they know that you have sent me. I have made you known to them, and will continue to make you known, in order that the love you have for me may be in them, and that I myself may be in them." Knowledge relates to divine life in the above verses. It contrasts with human knowledge. It is heavenly knowledge in contrast to earthly knowledge. It is the knowledge that derives from God's life, rather than the knowledge that supposedly begins from the life of the world. So in this prayer, Jesus also referred to the world, our fourth theme, in connection with knowledge. Now why is that? Because the world, with its human-centered worldviews, religions, and cultural plans, has its own version of knowledge, as we saw in the previous message. The limits of this knowledge contrast with the unlimited nature of the life-centered knowledge of God at the center. His revelation, the viewpoint, faith, our response to Him, and the divine outcome, His eternal plan. Consider the verses then that link knowledge and the world. Verse 3 is followed by reference to the earth and the world in verses 4 and 5. Verses 7 and 8 are preceded by verse 6, where Jesus referred to the disciples given by the Father out of the world. In verse 9, Jesus said, "I am not praying for the world." And in verse 11, He said, "I will remain in the world no longer, but they are still in the world." In verse 13, He said, "I am saying these things while I am still in the world." And in verse 14, He said, "The world has hated them, for they are not of the world, any more than I am not of the world." And then in verse 15, He said, "My prayer is not that you take them out of the world." This theme also relates to God's divine life, but in a negative way. Divine life is not of the world. Disciples are taken out of the world, and they are hated by the world because of their message of divine life. In the final verses of the prayer, Jesus finally puts the world in the perspective of God's eternal plan, because in verse 24, He said, "You loved me before the creation of the world." Finally, the last theme, oneness, is found in verses 11, 21, and 23. This theme, too, is characterized by God's life. In verse 11, in the first half of the prayer, Jesus prayed that the Father would protect the disciples by the power of His name, so that they may be one as we are one. In verse 21, in the last half of the prayer, Jesus prayed for all those who would believe in Him through the message of the disciples, that all of them may be one, Father, just as you are in me and I am in you. Verse 21 continues to refer to the unity of the disciples that would result in the world knowing that God sent Jesus. The Father and Son oneness, as we have seen, is based upon the divine life shared. Here, that same divine life would be the basis for the oneness of the disciples in the world. Unity was possible because of divine life within them. Even verse 24 suggests this oneness. Jesus said, "Father, I want those you have given me to be with me where I am." Now, He was not talking about sharing physical space with the disciples. He was talking about sharing common divine life with them. He was at the life-in-life position of life, and that was where He wanted them. The theme of God's life binds the entire Gospel of John together, and it is also the larger theme that unifies the 5 themes of the Lord's Prayer in John 17. It also binds each of the four themes with each other. Glory is related to the name. The name is related to the essential knowledge of the disciples. And knowledge contrasts with the world and is also related to a promised oneness for disciples in the world. That unifying dynamic brings us to some important conclusions about this prayer. The glory and the name reveal God's life. The knowledge, the world, and the oneness reveal the place and impact of God's life on human life. Therefore, the prayer encompasses the gospel, God's life in human life. Jesus was the perfect life-in-life man of God. That's the gospel. Disciples could become what he was, life-in-life people. People with the gospel for the whole world. Now, as I said at the beginning, I have not said all that could be said in 15 minutes about this fantastic prayer. But I do hope my 15 minutes have given you a new love for this prayer. So here are some concluding exercises. Number 1, for the word glory, which verse in John 17 most clearly shows the linkage of divine life and glory for you. Number 2, for the word name, which verse qualifies? For the word knowledge, for the word oneness. And then number 3, as a disciple of Jesus, which of the 5 themes affects your discipleship the most and why? When you are ready, please go on to John chapter 18, verses 1 to 40, and a message about Jesus in the world, but not of the world.